environment for everyone. And if you've noticed any issues, please reach out to Tasia or me or Jessica and notify us. Thank you so much. I also wanted to advertise our upcoming sessions. We have another session on the ethics and laws of generative AI and what are the best practices. This is an invited talk from a Google person, so hopefully it's not a marketing talk. And hopefully we will hear on the laws and ethics of generative AI. And this is an in-person meeting. It's a hybrid meeting, so you can also connect remotely. But if you are in Mesa Lab, you can attend that in person. And we will have also some discussions with the audience as well in that session. And we are also planning another session on debugging with generative AI tools with LLMs. Specifically, we're going to cover using GitHub Copilot for debugging. More details about that will be announced and advertised soon, but it's going to be November 13th at the same time. And a few folks reached out and asked how they can get GitHub Copilot licenses for NCAR users. And I kind of summarized the procedure for getting the GitHub Copilot license. So you have to be part of the GitHub organization. Your GitHub ID needs to be part of the GitHub NCAR's GitHub organization. And you also need to coordinate with your own lab and make sure you have a project key or a billing key that you can provide the help desk. And if you reach out to help desk, they will set up the license for you. And NCAR, from what I understood, they only provide business licenses. They don't provide enterprise licenses. There are a few differences here and there. But for most tasks, the business license should be enough. So that's a procedure that I use for getting the license. So if you want to take have the license, you can follow this procedure. With that being said, we can start. Brett, if you want to share your screen, I can stop sharing my screen. So first, we're going to hear from Brett about using VS Code and GitHub Copilot and connecting it to Casper and Derecho.
Megan, we do have a question in the chat, if there's time, about joining the NCAR GitHub org. I don't know if we have the directions for that off the top of our head, or if we can follow up later.
I can send the directions to for being part of the NCAR's organization. So it's Sam Raven. Okay, yeah, I can send him the directions, or I can put it in the chat as well.
All right, so we're going to get started today. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brett Newman. I'm a consultant with the Consultant Services Group within Sizzle here. And we're going to talk about VS Code and GitHub Copilot for NCAR systems. And I think I'll start off just by talking a bit about what our users are currently using to connect to these systems. And the two most common that we're seeing here are some version of terminal here, either the Mac terminal that's built in or PuTTY, something along those lines, and using VI as your code editor, maybe Emacs. If you need multi-window support, using something minimalist like Tmux, and there's really no GUI interface here. This is just the most basic approach you can go with very lightweight to connect to Casper and Derecho. And the other one we see quite a bit is Jupyter Hub. This offers a few more visualization tools. You have access to Jupyter Notebooks. You can use Terminal with some limitations. It's a little more difficult to do module loads, things of that nature. But a lot easier to kind of get an idea of visually what's going on and what you have open at the time. And one of the reasons we started exploring looking at VS Code as an editor and a little bit beyond that is just to maybe offload some of the work that's being done on Jupyter Hub. So occasionally it can be difficult to get a job. You'll sit in a queue for too long. You might not necessarily get a PBS batch job. So what are some alternatives to be able to use a code editor, connect to Derecho and Casper terminal, and just have this interface available as an alternative. So looking at VS Code, some of the features that are nice about it, has the option for this File Explorer window. This is nice. It can connect directly to Glade as soon as you connect to Derecho or Casper. You can transfer files by dragging and dropping. If you have a file on your local machine, you can just drag this into the File Explorer window and it'll handle all the transfers for you. So just makes it a little bit easier. You have access to some source control, some nice visualizations where you can see what files have been changed. You have shortcut buttons for, checking out or pushing or pulling things, making commits. And then probably the most powerful part about VS Code, why most people would want to use it, are the extensions that are available for it. And this allows you to use things like Jupyter notebooks and run them interactively. You can run cells within those, make edits to those. You can use NCAR kernels. You can use custom Conda kernels that you've created within these. You can also connect to these systems. I'll show using remote SSH. You have things like autocomplete or IntelliSense, and these extensions are for code like Fortran or C++. And these are completely separate from Copilot and some of the like auto code generation tools that come with it. So if you wanted to just explore VS Code without using Copilot, you can do that and see some of the extensions and nice features that exist within it. And of course, we'll talk about Copilot in a lot more detail in the future slides here. So this is just kind of a little window of my workspace, and just seeing that on the left side, you kind of have these different tabs for the extensions and Copilot chat. You've got the File Explorer, and then I have the terminal window in the bottom. And I'm currently just editing a markdown file and having a preview window. So there's just a lot you can fit into this one VS Code window. Pretty easy to switch in between and navigate, Glade file system or whatever file system you're connected to. If you want to follow along, just download it right now or explore it later. There's two ways to get it. If you have an NCAR device, you can just go on self-service. It's available through there. You can just search for Visual Studio Code. Alternatively, you can just go to the website. You can see the different versions that are available for VS Code here. So the first thing when you get VS Code set up and installed on your system is connecting to a remote system. So using this remote SSH tool, this is actually an extension within VS Code, but it gets installed automatically when you try to connect to a remote system for the first time. So first time you want to connect to Derecho or Casper, press F1 and it'll bring up the menu to select this remote SSH, open SSH host command. This is just kind of standard as if you would be logging into Terminal or PuTTY, where you'd be entering in your NCAR credentials at the system that you want to connect to. So like at casper.hpc.ucar.edu. And it's the same process. It'll prompt you for your username, which you enter in for that first prompt, and then your password, and you'll get that duo push. Now, once you've set that up for the first time, you'll have this button on the bottom left that makes it a little bit easier to connect up the next time. So you can connect on this SSH button. You can see right now on that image on the bottom left, I'm connected to Derecho, but you can click on that. It'll bring up the drop-down window. You can connect to any of the systems that you have in your SSH config file. You can just, with this button, you can click and type in a new remote system if you want, but it makes it a lot easier if you have these configured in your SSH config file on your local system. Another nice thing is that you can actually launch a remote session. So this will launch a new window. If you were to say on your local machine in the terminal window, you could use this code -- remote command to open up Derecho remotely and then provide a path. So let's say if you wanted to connect to a CSM project folder every single time, you could set up an alias on your local machine and have it launch into that every single time. Reduces a lot of clicking, saves a bit of time there. Once you're connected to the login nodes on Derecho, and that's what this SSH connection the first time will bring you to, is a login node. There's two modes you can operate on, and the first mode is called terminal mode, and this is really just a similar environment to Mac terminal over SSH. You can interface with the NCAR module stack. You can submit jobs via QSub, and you can navigate the file system using Linux commands here. You can also open up files in the preview window. If you just use the command code and then the path and the file name, this will open up that file in the preview window, and then you can use it as your kind of standard code editor. One thing to note here in terminal mode, and I'll expand on this a little bit when we talk about interactive mode, is that commands that are launched from the VS Code terminal are going to run on that node. So for example here, if I'm on if I start an interactive node, like on a compute node, and I launched that job using q-sub-i, so I have an interactive compute node. Any of the commands that are issued within the terminal window are going to run on the compute node. That isn't necessarily true for the interactive mode. So interactive mode is when you actually have a file open in the code editor, and it's that visualization aspect. So it includes things like operations with the file explorer, and it utilizes this VS server folder, this hidden folder that's set up on your home directory when you log in to Derecho or Casper login notes for the first time. And so what that means is that even if you were to say, launch an interactive job using q-sub and your terminal showed that you had an actual compute node in the terminal, if you're running commands, let's say a Jupyter Notebook cell in one of those preview windows, it's actually still going to be running the code on the login nodes. So one thing that you should consider here is that, like, if you're running code in a preview window, you should always assume that it's running on the login node and to be aware of that. And so connecting to the compute node, I'll go over that in the next few steps here. But just be aware of that.
We got one hand up real quick.
Yeah. John, go ahead.
Well, I lost visuals. I don't know if you stopped sharing the screen, but it's kind of hard to.
Oh, I'm seeing your slides, Brett.
I'm still seeing it as well, so.
Okay, it must be something I did wrong. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Assuming that everyone else can see the slides here, hopefully that's the case here, but let us know if, I need to stop sharing and then sharing again. Once you've connected up here and you have this option of being able to open a folder in the File Explorer window. So the default behavior when you log in the first time, if you're just using this SSH tool, is that it doesn't open a path on Derecho or Casper. And that has some implications later on, particularly for things like IntelliSense or code autocomplete, and then what Copilot has access to view and query when you're prompting a system. So when you open a folder, it generates this workspace. And so the workspace, that's always going to be what's available in view for VS Code. So just be mindful of that. Let's say if you opened up your Scratch directory as the first folder that you opened, it's going to be scanning that entire path and every directory that's below it. And so could potentially use up a lot of memory. It can take a lot of time to generate those autocompletes because it's going to be constantly scanning that entire path. So one thing you can do, there's actually two things that you can do to mitigate this. And the first is to open up a smaller or a smaller folder. And obviously there's just fewer files to access and scan over. But this also has a benefit of only limiting VS Code to see what's in that current path and having that as that workspace. Usually there are a lot of hidden files that are in, like, let's say your home directory, or if you have a GitHub repository, there's a lot of hidden files that exist in those. So another way to help out with that is to exclude some of those hidden files or files that aren't necessarily needed for code autocomplete or some querying that you have in your prompt. And I kind of have a list here of these wildcard patterns that we've determined are pretty good at reducing the amount of files that are scanned when you open up a folder in VS Code. So I've got a link to the Read the Docs page here where you can copy that, and then you can enter this into just your settings file within VS Code. So it's the code drop down into preferences and then settings. But as I mentioned, this is still going to scan the workspace. It just doesn't include this in some of the code autocompletes or querying for Copilot. If you wanted to be launching Jupyter Notebooks within VS Code, you do need to install this Jupyter extension. And there's this tab on the left, I've highlighted it. That's the extensions tab, and you can just search for Jupyter. When you install this default Jupyter, it'll add on quite a few other required extensions that you'll see if you're looking at your list of installed extensions. But it is important to note that once you have this installed, you also need to make your custom Conda kernels available to it. So the default ones, if you're connected to Derecho or Casper, those are available. And you can actually see those, and I'll show you how to select the kernels in the next slide. But if you have a custom environment that you created in Conda, then you do need to make it available like you would if you were going to use it in JupyterHub. So to actually select which Python or which kernel you're going to be using within VS Code, there's two different ways to do that. The first is to select the Python interpreter. And this is basically you just go and decide which version of Python and which environment you're going to be using to launch any Python code, or like a Jupyter notebook, for example. And those two things are separate, but there's some overlap in how those two operate. So to just deal with your Python environment, you'd open up this command palette. It's either F1 or Shift Command P. And then you'd select and search for your Python select interpreter. And you'll see it has a drop-down list. The default that it's recommending for me here is the NPL environments, but I also have a list of some of my custom Conda environments that exist on here. The other option is that if you have a notebook open, there is a select kernel button. If you click on that, it brings up that same dropdown, and this can be per notebook. You can select a kernel to run these on. So if you wanted to run let's say you have a really computationally intensive notebook that you want to run, but you're not sure if you're going to be able to run that safely on the login node, you can connect to the compute nodes within VS Code. The process is a little bit involved right now. For Casper, it is possible. For Derecho, there's some limitations based on the security issues from outside systems accessing Derecho directly to the compute nodes. But for Casper, the process goes by, first you'd connect up to the Casper login nodes using that standard remote SSH. And then from there, within a terminal window in VS Code, in that window, you'd launch an interactive job. You'd select your parameters. After that, you get your job, you get your compute node. You'd have to identify which node you are on. You can do that two ways. You can just see on that terminal prompt, either you're at the CRHTC32 node, for example, or you can just echo out the host name and get that. And from there, you just need to launch a new window. And it's important that it is a new VS Code window. And connect directly to the compute node using this remote SSH. And you can kind of see, I've provided the example of how you would connect directly to the compute node. And you can just confirm that when you have that SSH window that you're connected to a compute node and not just the Derecho logins. And before we go into talking about Copilot here, I just want to mention there's a step for VS Code where after you get the license activated, you do need to install this GitHub Copilot extension within VS Code. And then it'll prompt you to log in using those GitHub credentials. So once you have Copilot installed on VS Code, I'll just go briefly over it. It'll start up this new tab option on the left side of VS Code, and it is the Copilot chat window. And this is kind of your standard approach to providing a prompt to ChatGPT or something similar here. But there's a few features within this chat window that I found to be useful. And the first being that the plus sign will create a new chat for you. And this will actually clear out any of the context or scope that you've had for the chat that exists right now. The other thing is that if you hit this ellipse button, then you have the option to open the current chat in a new window. And that kind of allows you to save the state of the chat and open up a new chat within VS Code and have multiple chat windows open at the same time. So if you had something where you were querying a bunch of code and you wanted to save the state of that so you could continue querying that specific file or continue that line of questionings, you could just pop that window out to a new one and then start up a new chat window and ask questions in a different context. There's also the option to just run the in context mode is what they're referring to it as, which is just being able to actually query the Copilot options within the code preview itself. So if you have a file open, you can just right click Copilot and you get the options for selecting different options like document your code. And I'll go over those in a little bit more detail in a few slides here. But this also has the option within the preview window to auto-generate code for Copilot. You can see on the bottom right, it just it's very similar to autocomplete, but it just will be providing suggestions as you go and add additional things to your code here. Before we talk about prompting on these systems, I'd like to just kind of talk briefly about energy use on some of the models and just get an idea of maybe, you know, how much energy are we using when we have are prompting these systems per question. And so just looking at, there's this study that was done in 2022 that was looking at Bloom, which is a 176 billion parameter language model. And this was just kind of a study done to try and figure out how much energy it takes to train a model, and then how much energy it's going to take for users operating on the system per prompt. And you can kind of get an idea here, the total training time for this model, almost 120 days. The number of GPU hours for it, over 1 million. Total energy use, pretty significant. And this is using similar A100 GPU models that we use on Derecho. They use this, so the study that they did on Bloom, to infer some of the energy use for things like GPT-3. And GPT-3 was used as part of the design for Copilot, so we can kind of get an idea of the amount of energy that it took to train this specific model. And really, they're looking at 3 specific phases of power for training these models. And there's total power consumption for training, which is the 5th column here, the power consumption. And then you're looking at CO2 emissions for dynamic energy during the training, and then also looking at the total dynamic energy for training, and then the passive data center energy use. So just an idea of how much energy and some of the CO2 emissions used for these models. And I wanted to look specifically at, to give us an idea to drill down, you know, asking better questions for the prompt. So like, what exactly are we looking at for energy per prompt? And this study had shown, you know, what it would take is a 10-minute window and see how many prompts were sent in that 10-minute window, and then just try and analyze the amount of power usage. And so what we saw for this study was that if it's a single request, what we see is a 0.3 kilowatt hours of energy, and the almost idle amount, so if there are 0 prompts, just slightly less than that, so about 0.28 kilowatt hours. And this mostly scales with the number of prompts that were used in these 10-minute windows. And there are some exceptions to that, but it gives us a general idea of how much energy per prompt. And just to look at that in, you know, terms that, you know, like light bulbs or something like liters of water, so the treatment or bottled water process, the amount of energy it takes. Looking at just a single prompt here, we're looking at for light bulbs, if you're looking at LED, 18 watt hours per bulb, powering about 17 of those. A single prompt for water, it's about 5 liters of water. And you can kind of look in the scaling up of 100 prompts, it's about 6 liters of water. So just to give us an idea of, there's energy used for the training of these models, and then there's energy that exists not only for maintaining the infrastructure used that we query, so the GPUs that are used to query, but also the prompts themselves generate that inference and use up some energy. So I kind of use that to preface this next section, which is, you know, how do we ask better questions, and how do we make sure that when we're asking and prompting the models, do we ensure that the data that we have is in scope? There's also issues of, what do you want in the scope? Do you want to make sure that you don't have your entire Glade home directory available to the workspace? And just being able to really target specific data when you're asking these questions. And one of the big tools for that is this idea of the Copilot agent. And in particular, the workspace agent, I find to be the most useful for targeting specific data sets. And this ties into the VS Code workspaces that I referred to earlier, where if you say you open up a folder, that is the workspace within VS Code. It's the same concept here. And I have an example of that on the next slide. But for example, workspace, this actually takes quite a bit longer to query and produce results. And part of that is due to there's additional inference. It's looking at what's available in that workspace. But it does still end up sending your prompt with that information to the model itself. So there's still that additional baseline of the prompt and the energy that it uses. So the other that's probably most used would be this at GitHub agent. And this is really like if you, for example, wanted to look at, if you know, like a physics equations, how to send that to Fortran code or something along those, something that's been documented quite a bit, database operations, scripting, those sorts of things, non-domain specific code that you'd be sending that to. The other two agents, terminal and VS Code, I think are pretty self-explanatory, analyzing something that's done on the terminal or just VS Code questions in general. So to look back at this workspace idea, you'll see in this series of pictures here that this is the default mode when I log into Derecho. And you'll see I haven't opened a folder in VS Code yet, but I do have two files open in my preview window. And so when I ask Copilot, what's my current workspace, the only thing that it has access to is the two files that are open in this preview window. If I open up a folder in VS Code, and I have, for example, here this CESM folder, and then I have nothing open in my preview window, and I ask the same question and I query, what's my current workspace? This is actually going to look at the entire folder and the subdirectories that are available and open in this path that I have for CSM. So you can kind of see the difference that it's able to look at. So you can kind of combine this. You can have additional drill down functionality if you wanted to look specifically at what's open both in your workspace and in the editor. Or if you wanted to look at just a specific file. With these additional pound signs that you can use in the chat, you can look at, like I'll just go over an example for this specific file. If you wanted to explain only one file within that workspace. One thing to note here is that it's still bound by the workspace. So if I go and look for a script that's not opened in that file explorer, it simply just, it cannot look and provide any information about them. So just be aware that you're still bound by the workspace. And some of these other features to like fix or create tests are kind of going to be the same concept where they'll either default to a workspace or you need to be specific in which files you're looking at. The other options here, just to clarify, this editor window, it's just what's open in that preview window. And then this selection option is to, if you were to highlight a portion of the code, it's only going to look at that particular selection. There's two other options within here, which are really just related to the terminal. So if you wanted to see what the last terminal command did, you can use those to query just what's available in the terminal and not in your preview window. And just the last few tools here to look at. Just really, this is more so for that in context. If you have some code open in the preview window, the options that are available to you here, and the ability to explain code, the ability to either fix or make recommendations, and also quite useful that I found is this documentation option. You can highlight a section of the code, suggest that does documentation. You can either provide a function name, or you can just have it on the highlighted text. But you can also specify documentation standards. So you can be pretty clear in what type of documentation you want to generate. The tests function here, that's just going to create a new file. It'll generate some unit tests for the code that you've highlighted. And you can combine all of these and just be very specific about which files, which workspace, what data scope you want to be looking at. And so really, like, I think this is pretty useful if you wanted to, for example, have a better idea of some WARF functionality or some CSM functionality. What you could do potentially is you could clone some documentation into this workspace path, have that documentation available within the workspace, and then have Copilot be able to query the documentation within WARF. And so an example of this that I used was there's some HPC NCAR documentation that I have available. And if I wanted to say, for example, generate a PBS script that would launch a job on Casper, if I was just to go out to the internet and search for some of that information, I might get some wrong results. But if I have NCAR documentation in the workspace and available and I can query that, it'll actually look and see and be able to analyze that data and say, okay, you're looking for Casper specific scripts to launch this job. Here's, you would use the Casper queue. And I do actually have a screenshot later that shows what happens if you try and launch a prompt without the workspace and information that would be appropriate for that scope. So just the ability to really drill down on the data scope. These tools are pretty important to make sure that you minimize the number of prompts that you're using. You can verify that you're only looking for data that you want it to look for and nothing more, and just being aware of the limitations of the workspace. There's also this option that if you wanted to go to the GitHub Copilot option within the GitHub website to actually look for repositories themselves. And you can actually query these. There's a chat function for specific repositories. There's some limitations to that, but that is an option as well. And then just related to this workspace idea, there's the option to create a custom agent. This functionality is outside of what Copilot currently offers. This is through Microsoft 365, but it kind of expands on this idea of having a workspace where the workspace would be some proprietary set of information or data that you would be able to query, and that agent would only be available to you. That agent becomes available once you've created outside of VS Code. That would be available as one of these options within VS Code. So that is an option if you'd like to explore that. So I think I'll just finish up here with just some of my just personal experience and some ideas on what it's good at and what it's not so great at. And this is really just me, and it's backed up a little bit by some of the searches that I've done. But in general, it seems like anything that's been done quite a bit. So scripting or some code documentation, particularly if you're doing Bash or Python, generalized code and functions. So things specifically if it's Microsoft related, web apps, database operations, and pretty common like physics equations and porting those over into code. It does a pretty good job at porting code. There's some limitations to that I've found. So it's also pretty useful for visualizing data as long as it's within that scope. It has a difficult time if you're trying to use visualization tools that are not available to it. Things like NCO, other NetCDF related NCAR specific scripting languages. The other thing too is that it does seem to be pretty good at estimating processor or memory requirements within code that you have open. So this screen that I have on the right, just a simple query of what domain sizes can be used if I only have this constraint of 470 gigabytes of memory. And I think most of us, as we've done some coding and programming, we have an idea of what constraints are there. So being able to prompt this usually provides a good basis, at least for giving you kind of a ballpark ideas of those limitations. So other things that I found maybe not great or has some difficulty, requires a lot of help from the user to fix the code. Anytime the code becomes pretty complex, multiple files, if there's anything with scientific specific code, it has a difficult time getting beyond those non-trivial solutions. So there might be ways to get around that by providing additional input constraints. But there were instances where I would generate some function and it would create the function, but then it wouldn't know where to place that function call. So the function would exist, but never actually end up being used within the code. So some help to get that process moving along. And as I mentioned before, NCAR specific tasks, obviously, if you only are going out to the web search, there's some limitation for what's available to these NCAR systems. And my example here on the left is that I've asked it to create a Casper PBS script to launch on Casper, but unfortunately the queue is incorrect. It's using the old Cheyenne queue regular. It's using that MPT module, and this unfortunately is just going to be wrong. So there's definitely that opportunity of getting those wrong answers. And I think even Copilots themselves are suggesting that we verify the code that gets generated and double check and make sure that those prompts are accurate. But try and get that as close as we possibly can by being direct and clear and understanding what data is available within the scope of Copilot when we prompt to try and save some energy. So with that, I will stop here and take any questions. You can take a look through the chat.
Let's take a pause here. We got a couple minutes for the people who upvoted VS Code or maybe are already using VS Code, whether or not you have any experience with Copilot. Any questions for Brett? We had a question in the chat about, is it good at creating regular expressions? I had never even thought about it, but it sounds like people have already had good success using the chat plugin for regular expressions. That's probably way better than me pinging peers in Slack. So I'll keep that in mind.
There's another question in the chat about, so it says, I've heard of doing a recursive LS and providing that list to ChatGPT to provide workspace context instead of directly giving it access. Have you experimented with this at all?
So within VS Code, no, I have not provided that recursive LS. The terminal window does seem to be slightly separate from what that VS Code preview and file explorer is going to see. And it does seem like Copilot is looking specifically in those locations, unless you specify otherwise. So.
Sounds good. There's another question in the chat. Can it read and explain a regular expression? This is a follow-up to the previous question on making the regular expressions.
Rory says yes, and I believe.
Yeah, I see Rory says yes, and yeah, definitely. I've personally created some with the GPT-4, and I think, so that I have a question for you. Do you know what GitHub Copilot use as the underlying LLM? Is it GPT? I think it's GPT-4, but the version is not clear, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, that's what I was. Modified version of GPT 3.5 is what I've been seeing. So some, revision of that.
Okay. And is it possible to update that, like to change that LLM to use another version, or?
Not that I'm aware of. Now, there's the option to this idea of agents, which is becoming seemingly a slightly overloaded term, but using these different models within Copilot. So if that's, considered completely separate from Copilot, I'm not sure. But yeah, there's this option to query different agents within Copilot.
That sounds great and powerful. There's another question in the chat. Is the workspace using to explain, explain a main CPP? Does it explain based on comments or from the code directly?
So it's a combination of all of those things, and there's a lot going on under the hood, but it is analyzing both the comments and the code itself to try and get an idea. So if you were to, for example, if you had code that did not have any comments whatsoever, it would still be able to analyze that code and give you at least an estimation of what those functions are trying to do. I think that really the difference is going to be the comments, if they exist, might give you a little bit better idea of what's going on. But that if you already have thorough comments on the code, then kind of defeats the purpose of that, asking that question of what's going on in the code. So, but in my experience, if I have something that doesn't have any comments, I can ask it to explain and then immediately provide those comments for each one of those functions within the code itself. So pretty powerful for that. With the limitation, of course, of really complex code, it has some difficulty handling that.
So we have a follow-on question, and I'm wondering if maybe we can take a different approach with this one. How did you feel, Brett, if we pivot to Rory, but we come back to this other question, maybe in the form of a demo at the end? Specifically, the question is like, when you're documenting code, how high level does it get? And I've got my experience, but I think Breck or one of us can pull that up. I find it very good for giving you the 95% boilerplate, right? But it may not know if it doesn't have it in the context, it's not going to tell you what this variable means from a physics perspective. It might tell you that it's a required integer, and then you go fix that, right? But we can probably show that off here in just a second.
Yep, definitely agree with that. Gets you most of the way there for most of the queries.
Yeah. I'm anxious to hear Rory's impression as well, but I'll cut to the chase. Like this slide Brett has right now, where you have a very confident and very wrong answer. That, that's out there. It's like talking to a high school student. You just got to be, you got to be on your guard and always, trust but verify, I'd say. All right. Anything else VS Code specific? While Rory brings up his screen. Thank you, Brett. That was great.
All right, are we good on visuals and can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Cool. So I'm going to give a quicker overview of a lot of what Brett just said, how you set some of these things up in VI. I'll respond to Ben's question real quick about my general impression. I agree, it's very much in like a trust but verify. I'd love to have a talk in this series. It was just like dumb things and or subtle bugs that ChatGPT has introduced into my code in the last year. Because it can do a lot of things really well, but it's also like, I like to think of it as kind of the ultimate mansplainer. Like it's probably its biggest weakness is that it always gives you an answer. I've never had it, there's things if you say, hey, tell me how to make a bomb, it'll say, I can't tell you how to make a bomb. That's clearly like a constraint that they've put in for people's safety, et cetera. But any sort of like code question, if it doesn't know the answer, it won't say, I don't know, I don't really know the answer. It'll just give you an answer that's wrong. And so, yeah, it's definitely everything it tells you, take it with a grain of salt. That's my overall impression. Quickly about, so I'm talking about how to set this up in VI and or NeoVim. Prereqs, I'm basically going to assume you have some experience with Vim. I think based on Ben's little poll at the beginning, we were sort of like 2-to-1 Vim to Emacs, and Emacs to VS Code seemed to be about similar from the little sample. So maybe a lot of you aren't too familiar with Vim, but you don't have, if you want to check this out in Vim, you don't have to be a particularly advanced Vim user. But I figure you kind of would want to know how to move between windows, how to open files and write files and close files, copy paste, things like that. So, I think if you took a half an hour out of your life to learn the basics of Vim, you could also learn Copilot in Vim. Now, as I mentioned, there's kind of two tools I'm going to talk about. One is a plugin that's officially supported by GitHub called Copilot.vim. This one will work in either Vim or NeoVim. And the Vim we have on Derecho, one distinction, the one we have in the NCAR environment, unfortunately, is a little too old to work with this plugin. But the base one that's just installed on Derecho in the OS is recent enough to work. So if you just use userbin VI or userbin Vim, these plugins work fine with that. And then the second thing I'm going to talk about in a little bit, that actually requires a different, sort of a fancy person's version of Vim called NeoVim. Okay, so briefly what you would do to get this working on Derecho. The thing Brett mentioned at the beginning, step one, that's the important part, making sure your account is actually signed up to use this. And sort of it's authorized through your GitHub username, and the system knows about your GitHub username. But assuming that part has been done, then, like I said, you have to have a version of Vim, and the one in userbim will work. Then you have to install node.js. Those little commands there will do it and put it in your home directory. That's pretty simple. And then you have to install the plugin itself. Again, just a git clone and putting it in the right directory in your .vim directory. Pretty simple command. And then you actually start Vim up and you use this Copilot setup command. And it's been, I think, a little over a year since I did this the first time, and it seems pretty sticky. I couldn't undo it. I wanted to undo it so I could screenshot the process, but my memory is I didn't have to do anything because I already had a GitHub user agent running on a login node because I had been, working on code and stuff. And so it just sort of automatically found it and said, yep, I verify your GitHub username and you're allowed to use Copilot now. So that step was pretty painless. And then it's okay, what can you do once it's set up? So in its default mode, it makes suggestions as you type. And if you look at this little window I've got underneath, that's basically the stuff that is colored is stuff that I have typed, and then the stuff that's kind of grayed out there is like an inline suggestion it's making for me based on the context of what it sees in that file. So the basic commands, you can, as it's giving you these suggestions, you can accept them or dismiss them. You can partially accept parts of them. You can do it line by line or word by word. And you can also turn auto completion off. And I think this is actually a way I probably interact with it more because sometimes the auto completion can be a little heavyweight. So if you do Copilot disable, then you can ask it just when you want a suggestion. You can say, okay, I don't know what to do here, suggest something for me. So those are the basic commands: accept, dismiss, partial acceptance, and then autocomplete and accept the whole thing or just suggest parts. There's another mode called a panel, and that's a little bit more akin to when Brett was talking about the chat modality inside VS Code. Although I think, one of the reasons I'm talking about the NeoVim specific plugin in addition to this one is the NeoVim one has a chat mode that's quite a bit better. But this is like a kind of a poor man's version, if you will, of the chat mode. So you open a panel, so colon Copilot panel is the command to do that. And then it will open up a terminal window and it will give you multiple suggestions to look at. So you can sort of see the whole thing it's suggesting in scope. And you can select, like in this case, it gave 10 possible completions for the prompt I had on the right side of the screen. Sorry, the left-hand side of the screen, I should clarify. Left-hand side is the suggestions it's making to me, and the right-hand side is the context it's looking at. So basically just a comment where I've asked it to make a program to compute the collat sequence for a number. And so it generated 10 suggestions. I can cycle through those suggestions, and if I want, I can hit the enter key, and then it'll close this window and paste that back into my buffer. My experience with this mode in the basic, this basic Copilot.vim plugin is that it usually has a lot of stuff you don't want. And so in usage, the way I tend to use this panel is like I would say I just wanted that top function. Maybe that looks pretty good to me. I would just copy and paste that into the other buffer from Vim, as opposed to having it put the whole thing in, because the whole thing includes, you can see those comments and a main program and a bunch of other things I may not actually want in my code. So I don't use this mode too often. It's a little heavyweight to me. And then probably another thing for actually interacting with this tool, at least for me, so the way I connect to Derecho is via a Mac with the iTerm2 terminal app. And the key bindings didn't work great by default for me. So this is just a simple look at the way I rebound keys to bind them to Copilot commands. So just to aid my memory, I bound them to commands that start with the letter of the command. So like accepting, I bound to meta A. Meta is like the option key on a Mac. So option A will accept the suggestion. Option W or option L will accept a word or a line. Option D will dismiss, and option S will ask it to suggest something. And then another modification I made, similar to the workspaces Brett was talking about in VS Code, you can give it access to a workspace to sort of refine the context it's looking at. By default, for me, when I start Vim, I have it look in what my home directory. I have a directory called projects where most of my code tends to live. So by default, it looks at just sort of what I would call all of my code. You can also reset that in a particular buffer. You can assign that workspace to be an even narrower scope if you want. And always back up your vimrc before you make changes. But I don't actually, I use NeoVim more than Vim, so I have a pretty lightweight vimrc file. You're welcome to look at it. I think this is about the only things that are in there. And that's enough to make it a pretty functional tool for me. And then talking briefly about the more little bit better tool, frankly, in my opinion, this Copilot chat.invim. It does require NeoVim, like I said, and same thing. You have to have a GitHub account that's authorized to use it. But NeoVim itself, the installation, I'm not going to walk through all the steps just because we're trying to go through VI and Emacs fairly quickly here. But it's pretty easy. You can download a binary. For me, I just put that binary in my home directory. If this became popular and a lot of people, or people other than myself, were using NeoVim, we could easily add that to the NCAR stack too. So yeah, if this becomes a popular option, we'll just roll that into part of the default environment. But yeah, binary install, it takes about 80 megabytes, so it doesn't eat up too much space in your home directory. Then you have to install the Copilot.vim plugin, and you can use the exact same instructions I had earlier inside NeoVim to install that plugin. The second plugin, the fancier plugin, requires a little more setup. The installation instructions on the GitHub page are pretty clear, so I won't go through them. But it basically comes down to, do you have a favorite package manager? And then the installation instructions get a little specific to your package manager of choice. Oh, and feel free, like if you decide you want to play with this and you get stuck with installation, feel free to reach out to me and I can help you work through that. So like I said, this will basically do everything the other one does, but the chat commands are a little richer here. So you get these additional commands with this plugin, chat open and chat close. You can say chat and then give it a prompt. So Copilot chat, Copilot chat, write me a function to square all the even numbers, will give you that. Copilot chat models, that's something I'll mention briefly later, but I like that a lot. You can actually switch the underlying model that it's using to do queries. And then a lot of the same functions that Brett was showing in VS Code, so explain, review, fix, document, create tests. Those things are, you give it some context, like you highlight the code and then you say explain this, and it will give you a good explanation. I'll show some real quick examples of what that looks like with this plugin. So you can see here again, on the right side is my active buffer that I'm programming, and on the left side, I've opened the chat function, and I just gave it the prompt, write a C function that prints the collapse sequence again. So it's given me here a function that'll do that. Again, I would tend to just copy and paste the portions of this I wanted back into my active buffer. And so, that looks pretty similar to the panel view I showed in the simpler tool. But the place where it's different is this is sort of a persistent and active session. So like on the next slide, I've given it this other prompt. I said, that's great, but now do the same thing in Python. And it has some memory of what I just did. And it says, okay, I'll do the same thing for you, but give it to you in Python. So it can be a bit more conversational. It can refer to earlier things you've talked about, and it has a little more context of what you're trying to do. That's something that's not really available in the panel view of the simpler tool. So that's kind of the primary difference I wanted to pull out here. The explain, this is an example of that explain function. So again, on the right-hand side, so this is in a file that I called blarg.cpp to intentionally not give it much context from the file name. And I named the function blarg and made some random thing, again, so it doesn't have much context from the words I'm using. And then asked it to explain that. And it actually gives a fairly good explanation on the left-hand side of the panel, you can see. Picks up some interesting things, like I'm using a number in there that's the golden ratio, and it figures that out, even though there's no variable name to give it a hint. It says, oh, that's an approximation for phi, and can give you some pretty reasonable summaries of some unfamiliar functions. So, I find that fairly useful, particularly like if you're looking at other people's code, you just want to know, like, hey, what's going on here? It can give you a pretty good high-level synopsis. This is an example of the documentation one, so Copilot chat docs. Again, now I've highlighted that function and I've said, well, generate some documentation for this function, and you can see on the left-hand side the documentation that it generates, and it's documentation that's ready to be used with Markdown or something as well. So it can actually generate some pretty reasonable boilerplate. Like Ben was saying, I think a lot of this is like, yeah, you let it do the first pass, and then you go back and you kind of fix and refine what it does for you, but it does a good job of getting started. And then again, the last thing that is a unique feature to this plugin that I do really like is you can ask it what model it's using and what models are available for it to use. And the default one is the GPT-4o 2024-513, so option number 3. But you can switch that in the context here and use a different model. I suspect that that first option there, GPT-3.5 Turbo, is the one that that simpler plugin I used uses, because just in my experience, it gives worse answers, and that's an older model. And the GPT-4 series, the 4o series in particular, in my experience is significantly better. So by default, having this one start with 4o, I think it tends to give better answers. And then also, I'd like to call out number 5 there. This GPT-4o Mini is kind of like a I mean, it's a small model, and it's really focused on sort of programming, and sort of technical questions. And the advantage, I don't know if there's an advantage so much as like it alleviates your guilt somewhat in the sense that that's a cheaper model to train. It's both cheaper financially for your organization to query that model, and it's also less computationally expensive to query that model. So I run with the GPT-4o mini one quite a bit as well. So I think Ben is going to talk now about doing a lot of the same stuff in Emacs instead of VI. And yeah, I don't know, we can take some questions now or later or offline after the presentation, whatever folks like.
Thank you, Rory.
Yeah.
Yeah, for our VI users, anything you've got for Rory right now before we jump into mine? I'll ask you one. So the model selection is something I don't see on the Emacs side, and I didn't, I think they hide it a little bit more in the VS Code native instance. That's interesting. You've probably been using this for the longest of any of us that I'm aware of. How have you seen it evolve? Like, what's the rate of change on this technology from your perspective and that sort of thing?
My perspective, I would say, in particular, like I said, that 4.0, both GPT 4.0 and 4.0 mini seem to be sort of clever in a way that the other ones weren't. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I had mentioned to you just like coming up with some questions to try to fool it. It seems to be a little bit more reflective, maybe, on sort of what you're asking. Like a good example might be, so when in the 3.5 model is much more likely to paste something that feels like it just copied, like literally like looked at some other file it's read and copies it into a buffer. And what I mean by that is like it will sometimes do things like, okay, I ask it to write a function for me. It'll write a function for me, and it'll include a comment saying like written by Bob Thornton in April of 2021. And you're like, okay, so I know where you got this, right? And I see a lot less of that in the 4.0 series model, just based on my experience. It seems to, like it has more of a capability to actually understand and synthesize. So maybe actually, if it read 100,000 examples of the thing you're trying to do, instead of picking one that it thinks is the best, it might make you a new one based on what it's seen. That's all totally non-technical, but that's just kind of how it feels as an end user of the tool, I'd say.
Thanks for that. Any other Vim specific or questions for Rory? Okay, I'm going to jump into Emacs and go relatively quickly because some of this is going to start to be pretty familiar by now. Are we getting both audio and my slides coming through?
Yes, for me.
Thank you. So from a technical perspective, there's a reason we went with this ordering, because it turns out that the Emacs implementation of the Copilot plugins just steals directly from the Vim ones. So it's not a surprise to me to see that Rory's Vim options is a little bit more fully featured. That said, I've been using this only for literally like maybe a month or two, and have found it useful and kind of, I think, independently arrived in some of the same caveats that you've heard from the other speakers here today. So let me jump right into what's specific about Emacs. Again, the target audience here are people who prefer running Emacs already, and probably you've customized your environments once before. That said, personally, I am not an Emacs developer. I've been using it primarily for 25 years, but I still get nervous every time I get a new computer or have to find a new plugin or things of that nature, because I don't want to mess it up. So I like the tool. I'm a little bit nervous to modify it, but I found this configuration that works pretty well. There's at least 5 ways to do anything in Emacs. I'll show you the one way I figured out that works. I can't support them all, don't plan to support them all, so your mileage may vary. What we have here is just kind of a minimal configuration necessary to get Emacs working. This will work on Derecho and Casper, provided you have the GitHub account we talked about. It also works on your Mac, and I'll come back to, or your local machine. I'll come back to that in a moment. So there's really only a couple steps involved. The first is I use a package manager called straight.el. And this is I learned about this package manager in the course of preparing all this content. I'd never used it before, but it's a nice interface that allows you to install any of the Emacs plugins that exist out there in the ecosystem through GitHub, basically. If it exists on GitHub, straight.el knows how to find it and install it. And it's really cool. So I use that not just for what you're going to see here today, but additional editing modes for YAML files and Markdown and all that kind of stuff. So we have to have straight.el, and then we need to use that to install Copilot Emacs and Copilot Chat, which are the Emacs versions of the two tools that Rory just described. And then there's an initial setup and login, and then we'll go over some of the simple usage. And of course, save any existing configuration you have before you go mess with this in case you want to get back to where you started from. For me, that is my .emacs file and my .emacs.d folder. That's pretty default. So save those away before you go mucking around. It's really simple. If you're impatient, you can grab the relevant config out of my home directory and add it to your Emacs file and then launch it up, and everything should just work on our systems. I'll go through a little bit more detail though about what's happening behind the scenes, just so we're not doing this all blindly. So yeah, the Emacs config is probably 40 lines, and then you run a couple functions at the first time, and then you're set to go. So what exactly are we doing here? The first step is to install the package manager straight.el, which again, I mentioned, you may already use it. That's great. If you're not aware of it, it's pretty powerful. It bootstraps itself. It does require Git on the system and Emacs version 25 or newer. That's not a constraint, as we'll find out. The Git plugins require even newer versions of Emacs. So the documentation is linked here, but the gist of it is these lines now in my .emacs file, and you can pull them as well. We'll handle that configuration for you. So this is a simple prerequisite, pretty powerful. Once that's in place, two additional lines, and this shows how to use the straight.el plugin, right? So use package Copilot. This is all Lisp stuff. Don't modify this much, but it seems to work. So it uses the straight package manager to install the Copilot Emacs plugin from the source on GitHub. Similarly with the chat plugin. So that's all it takes. Those two sections combined, launch Emacs, and everything works. So what do these provide? Similarly to what Rory showed, so Copilot Emacs, I just kind of refer to this as autocomplete on steroids. It does very similar to what we've seen previously in the other two talks. I will say I have not yet uncovered the same amount of context information, metadata to be provided to this tool. So that is one area where I see strength in the VS Code and the Vim implementation that I'm continuing to watch, but haven't found quite as much, I'd say, granularity in controlling your search workspace and your context. Copilot Chat, on the other hand, is the Emacs. It's the interactive ChatGPT style, prompting selection of code. Give me the documentation. Can you describe that sort of thing? The only dependencies now, we need a slightly newer version of Emacs, something greater than or equal to version 27. The versions on the NCAR system satisfy this, no problem. We also need a functional version of Node in your Node and NPM in your path. As of yesterday, thanks to Brian Vanderwande, we have both of those in the default environment on Derecho and Casper. If you want to go replicate this on your home system, you'll just need to make sure you have Node.js and NPM installed as well. Okay, so once all that's done, you launch Emacs, and the first thing you're going to notice is after adding that config, it takes probably 1 or 2 minutes the first time you launch it. And that's because first off, straight.el is going to bootstrap itself from GitHub, and then it's going to install the additional 2 plugins we mentioned. That's a one-time first startup cost, again, 1 to 2 minutes. Don't be surprised, but that's what's going on. Then there's a one-time configuration in Emacs nomenclature. You run metax copilot install server. That will, again, probably take another minute. That's going to invoke the node command and npm in the background to install the actual plugin into your .emacs.v workspace directory. And then finally, the one-time login step of Copilot login will prompt you to authenticate into GitHub. And again, you have to have the plugin, or you have to have a Copilot associated with your GitHub account. But it'll give you a 6-digit code. You go enter that in, and you're good to go. So I've been able to do this both as my own user ID, and it doesn't matter what your username is on the system. I'll point it that way. The authentication is done through a local web browser that you're authenticated into GitHub. So that's helpful. Then lastly, I tend to turn on Copilot mode when I want inside a buffer. There is a global Copilot mode. I have not found that to be, well, I would say it's slow and buggy in ways that I don't understand yet. So I have not been a proponent of turning on global Copilot mode. I turn it on a case-by-case basis when I need it. So that's the setup. It's pretty straightforward. Happy to take any questions as people try that out. But once we have it up, I'll show a demo here in just a second of one use case, but you do get a number of common functions. Most of these shadow what we've seen in the Vim context. So again, Copilot mode will turn things on within a buffer. You can cycle through the completions very much as was shown in the Vim example. Those are native commands that get introduced by the Copilot mode plugin. I bind these to keys. There's a blog post linked in the charts here that gives you some more details on various key bindings that you can use. Personal decision, but I find that much more streamlined than interacting through like the Emacs mini buffer. So again, the Copilot mode is like autocomplete on steroids. That's all about the completion stuff, is where that functionality comes in. What I find maybe more useful are the Copilot chat plugins, and this is the version of what we've seen in VS Code and Vim already. You can explain, fix, review, doc. You can ask for optimization. You can also ask for tests. These are all sub functions that will either review the entire buffer or a selection that you have set up and give you either documentation. I find the explanation quite good, especially our role in consulting. Often we're working with codes that we're maybe not familiar with at all, or only passingly familiar. And then you can also in a very similar way have a direct chat display prompt interface. So I'll give you my kind of takeaway, and then I think we got a little bit of time. I can show you what that looks like real quickly before we go back for some broader questions. So my impression of this, only my opinion, but I will tell you, I don't really care much for the autocomplete features, at least as I've been able to use them so far. I've been using the built-in, very simplified Emacs completion for years, where it just, you type a partial string and you complete that string. I find that great. I also like that because I don't feel quite as guilty about my carbon footprint, and it works offline on airplanes without Wi-Fi. So to me, those are important. But that's my opinion. You might love this. Feel free to try it out. I do find the Copilot chat interface functions pretty useful, particularly review, explain, etc. But as we've mentioned a couple times already, you kind of need to have a healthy amount of skepticism, trust but verify. I also do like the Copilot chat display, simply because, yes, a lot of these same interface you can get through a web browser and ChatGPT or anything else. But for me, it's all about the context switching or the lack thereof. When I get deep into editing session and I'm in a code development compilation debug cycle, I really don't like going to a web browser, and that's a personal thing. There's just too many distractions there. There's email, there's so many other things, but like staying in the editor to me alone has value. And so I would say that, I think that alone is probably the main thing I'm going to use this technology for going forward. Another thing, so, I implemented this on Derecho prior to this session, obviously. And it is notably slower to start up Emacs. And that's that's, you know, it's maybe 10 seconds until I actually can start editing a file. If I don't have Emacs open already, if I want to open a file, it's about 10-second overhead before things are, you know, totally working. If all you want to do is, you know, change a character in your input file, that's probably something you don't want to deal with. So remind everybody, if you don't know already, Emacs -Q is a quick startup. It bypasses any kind of, you know, per user customization. So if you implement this on Derecho and you find that it's a little too slow for you sometimes, just remember Emacs -Q will get you there quickly. And that kind of brings me to the last point. And this is something you know, in consulting, we have a little bit of a challenge because we cannot control your home computer environment, right? We can help get things set up and debug on shared resources like Derecho and Casper. And so the demonstration I've got today will certainly run there. But I want to be honest, that's not typically how I run Emacs in my day-to-day operations. Usually I run Emacs on my Mac. I find that gives me a better GUI experience. And I then edit buffers remotely through an SSH connection, and that's built into Emacs and it's worked for years. If you're interested in that, we can talk about that as a separate follow-on. So, you know, where am I going with this for my own personal use? I'm not sure I will use this on the Derecho logins on a day-to-day basis, but I'm going to continue to use it on my Mac as I've gotten used to already. In the backup here, there's the full listing of that Emacs configuration. There's my key bindings, but let me show you quickly just kind of what this looks like. And stop sharing, and I'll share a different window. And now I am on my Mac. You can tell by the nice GUI version of Emacs I've got running. How are those font sizes, Megan? Can you see that?
Can you make them a little bit bigger? Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So I'm in a source file. This is a C++ source file. The whole thing is what? Ooh, 2,000 lines. So I feel a little bit guilty, but I'm going to select it all, and I'm going to ask Copilot chat review. And this kind of gets to Haing's question earlier. Where is it drawing its information from? So first, you see this now puts me in a different window. It asked Copilot to review that function, gave me a little timestamp. It's part of the libmesh finite element library. Yep, I knew that. It does describe every function in here, whether they're documented or not in the source code, internal ones as well. And what I'm expecting is as this gets to the end here, it might actually give us some demo code for how to use it and provide suggestions for changes. So yeah, where I find this particularly useful is, again, like in our role in consulting, we may be operating with code that we're not totally familiar with. Or even in this case, this code is you know, heavily C++ era 2003-ish. And that's still kind of how I often write C++. So as language standards change, I've found this tool very helpful to suggest kind of new implementations of things that maybe wouldn't necessarily pop into my head originally, just because you know, I'm not entirely up to speed on C++ 17 yet. So yeah, you can see that we got a detailed description of each function. I got a couple suggestions for improvement. And we got example use case. So that's just one of several functions. We can ask it similarly to fix it. We can ask it to optimize it. And again, pretty powerful. I tend to use this now sort of in it's kind of a, you know, machine version of a code review, right? So I've found it most useful in that regard. Okay. We still have about 15 minutes left in the session, which is about right. So let me pop back over to the chat and see what we got.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks so much, Ben. And thanks also for sharing your shortcuts and key bindings on Emacs. That's great. There is a question in the chat. So Let me see. This may have already been answered, but what are the security risks of giving Copilot large blocks of code, especially that something that reveals internal operations? I've heard that there are certainly a lot of risks with GPT Online, but do those still exist with Copilot?
They do. I mean, these technologies are super opaque, right? Like it took that code and it sent it to a cloud and it returned that result, right? Now, what happened with it once it got to the cloud? I'm not sure. That code example is open source. It was already exists on GitHub. So, but yes, like, go ahead, Rory, your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I wouldn't share if I had something that was important that I didn't want other eyes to see, then I wouldn't share it with a bot any more than I'd share it with a random human. I don't trust that things go into the cloud are kept private, even if that's what we're told.
So Enrico had a question for me on Emacs, and I think the answer is generally true across the board. But the answer is yes. Like if you start a chat and it gives you an answer, if you continue the chat in that same window with that same context, it'll refine it, right? So like I do this. I'm trying to think of a good example. I've asked questions before, it gives me an answer, and then all I have to say is something like, okay, now can you rewrite that using a Lambda function? Okay, and so yes.
And I'll add too, I think because they're using the same plugin, this is probably true of the Emacs one, but on VI, you can also save a chat context to disk and load it like a month later. So you can sort of make those persistent too if you have a particular chat that it's referring to and has been useful.
There is another follow-up question on the using VS Code with Copilot on Casper. The question is that they found it very useful and they want to do development and analysis in Jupyter Hub, but also want to use VS Code with Copilot. Any concerns or any issues with starting VS Code on Casper login nodes that they should be aware of? Ben, do you want to answer, or I can answer the question as well?
Sorry, and the question was specifically related to VS Code on Casper login nodes?
Yes, yep.
So login node usage, the guidance is as it always has been, right? Be a good citizen. So the most important thing with respect to running VS Code on the login nodes, and if honestly, if you have a question or if you're concerned about it, I would recommend for now running them on the Derecho login nodes. And the reason for that is we have more of them and we have better per user process controls. That said, you may be familiar with our Arbiter process policing that we have on Derecho that we're working to put on Casper as well. But the biggest issues, and Brett can probably jump in here because he's used VS Code more than I have, is if you have a kind of like your workspace explodes, right? Like if you accidentally let it index all of Scratch, you will run out of memory. And you might get killed or we'll kill your job or that sort of thing. But properly configured, there's not a concern, running the editing functions on the login nodes.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. It's really just a matter of the workspace size and then factoring in computationally intensive or memory intensive code, just being a good citizen.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. And we have some documentations on like limiting the resource usage on Casper and Derecho. I can add it here. There's another follow-up question, Brett, that you might be also interested in answering this about VS Code. Can the workspace explain the function in a file, explain the function with all the dependent sub-functions in other files?
Yeah, as long as those are available within that same workspace. So the only time you run into issues and you have some missing sub-functions or functions outside of that file that would get missed is if you don't include those within the workspace. So opening up and making sure that you're at that top level directory where all the functions would exist is probably the best bet if you want to make sure you don't miss anything.
Sounds great. Are there any other questions in the audience? You can also raise your hands if you want to ask the questions yourselves. Oh, there is another question. We sometimes see VS Code launched RG or ripgrep processes accumulate on school's login node. I suspect some VS Code extension constantly interrogating the files. Brett and Ben, if you want to answer this question.
I'm not familiar with that process, but we have seen, the command node, which kind of underlies everything, explode in memory usage. I believe that are there any particular plugins? We obviously haven't advocated for a plugin today that we know misbehaves, but let me open this up to kind of all of CSG or HSG as well. Are there any plugins that you have encountered that we should explicitly steer people away from?
I haven't, but there are a lot of different extensions, and it's really there are many extensions out there. So if you want to install any extension on your VS Code, just be careful. It's from a well-known publisher, and it has like some, at least like it's from a company that's well-known. So yeah, because there are a lot of third-party extensions available on VS Code as well. Some look shady, but yeah. And the processes that you mentioned, I'm not also familiar with those processes they accumulate on the login nodes, but it might be due to the IntelliSense that VS Code is using. So one thing is just like to limit the number of like extensions and make sure like all the extensions are limited and see like how much processes you see on each node, and then after that start like adding extensions one by one to see like which one is causing that.
And I think too on Derecho, if you're using VS Code, because of Arbiter on the login nodes, if you abuse it, like you will get caught, your processes will be killed. And so if that happens to you using VS Code and you don't know what extension is responsible, there's a thing called extension bisect inside VS Code. You can go through and it basically turns off half your extensions and turns off the other half, et cetera, and sort of bisects its way down to find problematic extensions. So you could use that tool. You could also, like, if you just get killed by Arbiter with VS Code, just get a hold of CSG and we can help you figure out what it is and work through that too.
Yeah, and I'll just comment too that in my experience, the extensions are problematic. I've seen instances of runaway IntelliSense where it'll continue running after closing the window, things of that nature, using up a lot of resources. So definitely extensions are both security-wise and performance-wise, the big variable for VS Code.
I want to thank everybody today. We had another good turnout. So we will be releasing the recording, and we'll also collate these 3 presentations and make them available to participants and also more broadly on the web. I just do want to also point out that with the exception of VS Code, that's the one that has the VS Code implementation of Copilot that Brett showed. That's the one that has a corporation supporting it, right? The rest of this exists in the free and open source software ecosystems, typically developed by volunteers. And so who knows, right? Like this is all brand new technology. Rory came across the VI plugin as an enthusiast and has been using it for a bit. I am later to the game, but got the Emacs stuff working, but there's also no guarantee that it really sticks around in I don't know, a year from now. It's a rapidly emerging ecosystem. So we're going to keep an eye on it, and the guidance can change over time. And we'll just do our best, but we're learning this as we go along as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ben and Rory and Brett. Thank you. And thank you everyone that attended this session. We will see you next week on Wednesday. And again, the session is both in person. You can attend in person or remotely. Yeah, thank you everyone, and see you on Wednesday.